Welcome, friends. This is the last episode of Season 2, Mexico. Reflections. Reflections on a season. We want to thank you very much for listening, and we hope that the conversations we've had over the last 6 months have brought some clarity to the complexity surrounding the issues of tourism, exile, and radical hospitality in Mexico. The pod, as always, is a lot of work. This season, we've had the very kind and sincere help of friends Adair from OjoViajero, Mim from MitamineLab in Mexico City, Patricia from Oaxaca, and Human from Brazil. Lastly, just a reminder, we have our Patreon page up at patreon.com/theendoftourism. Running a podcast is a lot of work. And so I want to say thank you to our patrons for keeping the pod going. That said, if you've been listening, and you've been interested in the conversations, you've been engaging in them with your friends and family at home, it always helps to let us know. There are ways that you can support the pod if you can't financially. If you'd like to, if you can financially, you can do so at patreon.com/theendoftourism for any amount. And but if you'd like to get in touch, if you'd like to, let us know how we're doing, as well as support in any other way, we're more than happy to listen to what you might have to gift. So thank you all, and here we go. Welcome to the End of Tourism Season 2, Mexico. During Season 1, which is available in English on all major podcast platforms, friends and strangers throughout Mexico reached out and asked for conversations on what is happening in Mexico. With episodes in both Spanish and English, we have delivered. The episodes will touch on diverse themes including gentrification, deforestation and climate change, displacement, spiritual and psychedelic tourism, ecotourism, hospitality and interculturality, the industry itself, and the place of workers in it. We speak to activists, scholars, storytellers, and workers in order to find out what is happening behind the scenes and what can be done about it. Season 2 is dedicated to our late friend and mentor, Gustavo Esteva, elder and co-founder of the Unitierra Oaxaca in Oaxaca, Mexico. These episodes have been planned and organized in collaboration with our compañeros and compañeras at the Unitierra Oaxaca. They are dispatches from the resistance. Good afternoon, friends, strangers, travelers. This last episode of Season 2 Mexico is a bit of an offering of reflections. Now, we did a version of this in Spanish with Wendy from the Unitierra Oaxaca, and I'm not going to translate. I'm just going to go over some of the things that we learned over the course of the last 6 months, in part through our interviews, through our reflections on those interviews, and on the feedback that's come through from people in Mexico and beyond, as well as the things that have come up as a result. So before we start, I'd like to first offer my immense gratitude to the Unitierra Oaxaca, the Universidad de la Tierra, which translates as the University of the Earth here in Oaxaca, to their staff, and to our old late friend and mentor Gustavo Esteva, who passed earlier this year in March, and who this season is dedicated to. Gustavo had an idea of a project in mind before he died, entitled Fuera los Bárbaros de Oaxaca, which loosely translates as "To the Barbarians in Oaxaca, get out." Now, it's certainly a some of Gustavo's dark humor, as well as a kind of sleight of hand way of saying that the barbarians are the tourists, that the barbarians are the foreigners, right? Now, Gustavo certainly had a sense of dark humor, but he also had a deep desire to build interculturality and intercultural projects between people in this context of different nation states, of different ethnic backgrounds, of different languages. And so that news came to me after his death, that he had this project in mind, but unfortunately didn't have time to propose it to me. And so we decided, in partnership with the staff at the Unitierra, and specifically Wendy Juarez, to craft a series of conversations dedicated to him and dedicated to Oaxaca and Mexico, both in Spanish and English, as a way of contending with all of the themes that are on the table, on the proverbial table, so to speak, in our time. And as well, use some of Gustavo's reflections on tourism, exile, migration, gentrification, and radical hospitality. And so that's what we did. And that's what we've been doing for the last half year or so. And so, a deep bow once more to his mentorship and willingness to proceed as if all of this matters in the world. It's very likely that this podcast would not exist if it weren't for my friendship, my relationships, and my learnings, and the learnings that I had with Gustavo, and of course the rest of the team, the family at the Unitierra Oaxaca. So, fuera los bárbaros de Oaxaca, Barbarians of Oaxaca, get out. So that's even though that's a little under a year ago, 8 to 10 months ago maybe, and I guess a year ago now that he was planning that's very much become a sentiment among a lot of people here. I shouldn't say a lot. That's probably overstated, right? But it's probably overstated in the sense that you see it more often than it's actually felt or agreed upon in social media and on the walls, the graffiti here in Oaxaca. And so that brings me to our the first episode that we recorded was with Marcos Esmar. That was entitled Resistiendo el Espectáculo en Oaxaca, Resisting the Spectacle in Oaxaca. And Esmar, along with some other friends, put together a zine that was entitled Desprecio y Despojo, Gentrificación y Turismo en Oaxaca. Okay, and basically gentrification and tourism in Oaxaca and the consequences of it, right? And so we discussed a fair amount of things. We discussed this notion of the spectacle, and I'll get to that in a moment. We discussed what he referred to as the touristic apartheid, which you see in many, many cities throughout the world now, many tourist cities, which is basically a certain area of the city, typically the historic center, is turned into a kind of tourist ghetto, wherein local people don't live there anymore, right? It becomes essentially a place for foreigners to come and stay short term. And today we could say that those tourist ghettos have become Airbnb ghettos, right? That's definitely the trajectory, the direction that the economy of housing in tourist cities is going towards. We discussed the occupation of Oaxaca City by its occupants in 2006 and the consequences of that on tourism, and how basically the government here used tourism as a wedge in order to stop people from organizing communally, locally, and certainly against the government. And it worked probably better than they imagined because, of course, as I just said, this historic center, which was largely a battlefield during that time, has become essentially a kind of, a tourist ghetto, for lack of a better word. We discussed gentrification. We discussed this notion of tourist etiquette, that when you go to a new place, you kind of try to act as the locals do. But what happens in a tourist city or tourist town when the locals have been converted into vendors, right? That their economic lives basically revolve around giving the tourists what they want, right? Suddenly the etiquette is no longer local, but it's become this globalized thing that tourism has brought in from outside, right? And perhaps at best, the locals have a way of putting their own, mother tongue or local language, stamping that onto the interactions. So what your way of acting in a new place based on what you see isn't necessarily any longer something you can rely on as a kind of way of entering into unique and sincere intercultural relationships with other people, right? And we spoke about the spectacle. We spoke about social media and the rise of xenophobia, gringophobia, resentment, and even hatred towards the foreigner, right? And I would say that that xenophobia is a word, or touristophobia is a word or concept that doesn't really, it's not accurate. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, we're trying to be accurate and honest and sincere in our language, right? But to be xenophobic, to be touristophobic is to be afraid of the tourist, is to be afraid of the foreigner, which is not what we're seeing, right? It's not what we're seeing in the streets. It's not what we're seeing online. What we're seeing is resentment. What we're seeing is, hate. Not always, but what social media does certainly is it has the opportunity for people to hide behind a screen, right? And even without doing that, to know that there's little responsibility that one has to bear because one is invisible for the most part, or at least untouchable in the sense that people don't know where they are and there's no real sense of enduring consequence for one's actions, right? And so social media, especially memes and reels and, all of the more TikToks and all of the more recent ways of communicating, which isn't really a way of communicating, it's just a way of vomiting, right? It's just a way of putting something out there. It's a monologue, much like this is, right? But in the context of these other mediums, memes, reels, and TikToks, I guess, while they can stretch into the minutes and maybe even hours, generally it takes someone a very, very short amount of time to consume them or to try to understand them or read them or view them, right? And so what this does is in an inverse context is that it's actually demanding as little of you as possible, right? There's nothing required of you. And in fact, the medium, it doesn't matter what the content is, right? Because the medium itself is telling you that we can only fit this much information in this amount of seconds or in this tiny little square, right? And therefore there's nothing really outside of this square, this size, this shape of this medium that will demand you to ask more. And in fact, the medium encourages people, generally speaking, to not ask more, to just accept what's there in that little bubble, right? And so this is what we start to see. Not only do we start to see a kind of petrified resentment that has very little context, that acts as a kind of cathartic drug. Here, take the pill, take the meme, put it on your tongue, swallow it, and because someone else is thinking what you want to say but haven't been able to put together, even in a single sentence. Well, I mean, that's then they get their likes and all that stuff, right? But what started to happen in Mexico, especially as a result of the more recent inundation or wave of migration of foreigners, especially quote unquote digital nomads from the United States, but certainly other places and certainly in other contexts, you start to see this resentment rising up quite a bit, right? In Mexico City, in Oaxaca, etc. And these memes, this media, etc., is not only being followed by, I mean, you see these accounts with tens of thousands and sometimes even hundreds of thousands of followers. And it makes me wonder is there actually that many people following them? Because, it's really easy to just buy followers that don't actually exist. They're just bots, right? So I wonder about that. And I wonder about it because at the same time, these people we're assuming they're people, right? That they're not actually bots themselves and things like that. That traditionally this kind of, leftist rhetoric, I mean, traditionally anyways, conventionally, the understanding of the consequences of hypermobility and gentrification and over-tourism, something generally taken up by those on the left. But now the consequences of it is that there is this focus towards identitarianism. And what's happening as a result is that the people who are posting these memes, etc., the resentment, gringophobic memes and media are now capitalizing on that in the very sincerest economic sense of the word, which is to say they are commodifying their message, right? Turning it into products. Where I've seen recently, you can now purchase hats and T-shirts, on one account that says I am gringophobic or something to that degree, right? And so, it really, this is, it's very clear that this is not something that an anti-capitalist would do, right? Or someone who's traditionally on the left in that regard. And so it makes me wonder who's actually behind these accounts, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not just that they're posting all these memes and they have this liberty to do so, etc. And none of them are actually showing up with their own voice, with their own face, saying, this is who I am, this is where my message comes from, ideologically, politically, etc. None of them. Nobody does it, right? None of the memesters. And, not only is there a sense of cowardice in this, but it makes you wonder as well, why not? If the message was so clear, so sincere, so important, why wouldn't you stand up and stand for what you're talking about, stand for, what you believe in? And that's because there's a real likelihood that these people are not leftists, they are not anti-capitalists, and that they are, in fact, trying to, whether it's conscious or not, drive a wedge into the possibility of intercultural, we could say meeting, we could say encounters, we could even say reconciliations, because that's really what an honest and proper path, achieved path towards interculturality would look like, was one based in conciliation and, where necessary, where applicable, reconciliation. So that's a little bit of a reflection on this, what's happened, what I've seen over the last 6 to 8 months here in Oaxaca and Mexico City, right? Is that people really, really need to start questioning, especially these, reels and memes and things like that, where it's coming from. Because what I see here, especially people, quote unquote, on the left, quote unquote, anti-capitalist and all this stuff, sharing this stuff up, because it hits that cathartic nerve. And it's like, boom. But guess what? At the end of the day, you're fighting the enemy's battle for them. Okay? All right. So from there, I'll just mention that we interviewed the Wirikuta Preservation Project. And, a lot of that interview was based around some people that I met about a year ago in this state of Mexico. And they told me about this project. And basically, it's an international project between between one particular village in the Huiratica region of Mexico, of the indigenous Huiratica people, and some of their friends and co-workers, colleagues, compañeros in the United States. And the plan among them is to buy as much land as they possibly can in the area around in the Wirikuta, in the traditional Huiratica territory, in order to stop deforestation of traditional peyote desert, traditional peyote lands, as well as to stop mining, as well as, how would you say it, large-scale tomato farms, which are often being financed in part, or at least stewarded by narcos, by cartels here in the north of Mexico. And the industry, which is actually seeding the air there with weather, how do you say this? Cloud seeding, basically, right? Weather manipulation. Because it's a desert, and because tomatoes, sure, they need lots of sun, but they also need water, right? So all of that's going on in the north, and I'm proud to say that the WPP, they succeeded in the next step of their fundraising goals. And so what they had set out about a year ago was properly financed, and they're going to continue in this way, because at the end of the day, this is a huge area in the north of Mexico that spans many states. And so this is the beginning of a really beautiful project. We also talked about psychedelic tourism, about this notion that there's so many ceremonies. I mean, in scare quotes, ceremonies, because if these things are a dime a dozen now, are they still ceremonies? I mean, it really makes you wonder. Excuse me. Ceremonies that are being marketed online. Again, you don't know who the people are necessarily. You don't know if their lineage or connection to the pueblos, the villages, the traditional villages and traditional communities is intact, if they have been properly initiated as someone who can steward and facilitate these ceremonies. And so we talked a lot about that. And it's not just charlatans from other cultures or other communities, but it's also people within the Huiratica nation, within the Huiratica Pueblo, that are taking this medicine and basically capitalizing on it and facilitating ceremonies without authorization. And so it was a really great opportunity to speak with Santiago and Guadalupe from the Huiratica Nation about this, and to hear, so to speak, from the horse's mouth, what this is doing to their villages, both psychedelic tourism on one end, and the conventional Western industries of extraction in their lands. And how guests in their lands, how visitors, how people interested in the Wirrárica nation and the Wirrárica culture in what we call peyote or hikuri, and how such people can act honorably, right, in accordance with the ancestral custodians of this incredible medicine, right, and plant and ancestor. So that was a really, really nutritious, nourishing episode. I should say episodes. We did two. One with Guadalupe and Santiago, and then the other one with Elira. From there, we went to the Yucatan Peninsula, around the areas where today you find Cancun, Tulum, Mérida, Valladolid, and many, many other both tourist and local towns. And we spoke with Pedro Uci, who is in part one of the spokespeople for the Asamblea Muc Jimbal, the Assembly Muc Jimbal there, that is fighting against the construction of the Mexican President AMLO's pet project, the Train Maya, or Maya Train. Now, just so we're clear, among his people, nobody refers to the train as the Maya train, of course, because they never gave permission, of course, for this project, for their ancestral name to be used as such. And so just a brief overview is that the train Maya, or the Maya train, which we'll call the AMLO train for the sake of this episode, AMLO, the acronym for the Mexican president's name. The AMLO train is basically a tourist railway, which will surely be hauling other things apart from tourists, but principally a tourist train set to encircle the entire Yucatan Peninsula. And, it's just mind-boggling that the construction started and that it even continues when none of the local communities gave their okay on the project, as well as the incredible amount of environmental scientists that have spoken out about this as just being one of the stupidest things that anyone can do, in part because the Yucatan Peninsula has a soil quality that is more or less limestone, okay, which is to say it's extremely fragile. And this is why you see what are referred to as cenotes in the Yucatan Peninsula, these massive sinkholes that themselves have been turned into tourist attractions, and that sometimes are 50, 60, 100 feet deep, right? And so the Mexican federal government in concert with state governments in that area are basically building railways on top of sandstone, right? On top of limestone. And you can just imagine, with any kind of train today, it doesn't matter how many people you have on it, etc. You're just asking for it, and it will happen, right? They are probably going to push ahead, right, to finish this thing and say, look what we did, right? And it probably won't take long for it to become one of the most ridiculous and hopefully not tragic, but that's definitely in the cards given what's come. So we spoke to Pedro and we spoke about the struggle that his people are waging against the government there, and it was really, really, really incredible to hear from him and to hear him speak in the way that he did. And, this is something that I think so many tourists make their way to the Yucatan Peninsula, to Cancun, to Merida, to Tulum, to Playa del Carmen, to Cozumel, and on and on. And Mexican nationals as well. So this is something that, if you know anyone who lives in these places, if you live in these places, if you know people are going to visit there, tell them about this, right? Tell them about this because, one of the things that Pedro said at the end of our talk together was, we don't hate tourists. We love when people come to see us, to come to visit us, one-on-one, as visitors, as guests, right? And not as tourists. And so this is what he was saying, right? That this is what we, from out of our grandparents and great-grandparents' lineage of hospitality towards the other, towards the foreigner. This is something that, we refuse to lose, that we want to continue to practice. But we're not going to do it with tourism. So, this is an opportunity, I think, for a lot of people to stand in solidarity. And if that means not going to the Yucatan, then maybe that's what it means. If it means getting in touch with Pedro and the Asamblea, maybe that's what it means, right? And so, this never ends. And we continued with a talk with my good friend Elias Gomez Gonzalez, who's based out of Guadalajara, Jalisco. And I know him from the Unitierra here in Oaxaca. And Elias and I spoke largely about interculturality as a kind of grandchild of interreligiosity, right? So for a long, long time, there have been aspects of different major religions in the world that philosophers will say, that sought to find a way, an ecumenical way to bridge, or at least construct the bridges between religions, right? To find the meeting point and the language for the meeting point among different peoples and different cultures that, at least apparently, at least superficially, hold worldviews that are not only inherently contradictory to the other's worldviews, but even hostile. And so today we refer to this, this kind of philosophizing as interculturality, in part because not everyone's religious, but so you could use the term culture as a stand-in for religion. Excuse me. And so we spoke at length about the notion of plurality, the notion of difference and diversity, and how the sentiment here in Mexico that's happening as a result of the vast and very, very rapid construction and inundation of over-tourism, as well as migration, that there is this sentiment that there are two Mexicos, right? That there is one that exists for the rich, for rich Mexicans, and for foreigners, and then the other one for everyone else, right? And this is something that, I think if you're an English speaker, this is extremely, extremely important for you to understand. This isn't just, these aren't just ideas. These aren't just like someone imagining things. This is the perceived, lived understanding of what's happening right now across the board, right? And that it's nothing new either. It's just become more concentrated, more exacerbated by the movement. And of course, these stratified aspects of the society are not just coming from outside. In fact, the Mexican government has been inviting this clearly over the course of the pandemic and previously. And so we talked about the basis for encounter, the basis for learning among peoples from different places, right? And that there's always this plurality, this diversity of difference among a people, even if the people claim the same, nation, gender, sexuality, race, etc., right? All of those things, there's always plurality within them, right? And that this plurality or diversity is not just needed, but mandatory, obligatory for hospitality to arise, right? This way of entering into, however slowly, friendship with the foreigner or the local or the other, the neighbor, the stranger, right? That hospitality is the basis for the possibility of interculturality arising in our time, right? And so how do we find, both as locals, as foreigners, as expats, as guests, as visitors, as hosts, how do we find a way, and how can we find a way among each other, with each other, in times of ever-increasing hostility, ever-increasing inequality, to court and conjure that hospitality, right? And so that was a big part of what Elias and I spoke of. And then we turned towards a subject, a theme of the pod that doesn't really get talked about much, right? But which is really, really important, which is the voice, the viewpoint of the worker, right? Because at the end of the day, the industry is supported by the people that work in it, right? And so they are the threshold, the workers are the threshold, the bridge between the tourist who comes with their expectations and money, typically, and the business owners, the industry, who invites them in that way, typically, right? And so within the context of the working class, within the context of the people who are tourism workers, how, especially in Mexico, how can we understand ourselves as holding a certain amount of power in the conversation, right? Because if you live in a place, if you're from a place, and the very work you contribute to is destroying your place and destroying your capacity to live in that place, destroy your capacity to just even get by in that place, and not to mention the culture and all of the invisibles, the invisible factors. What can be done, right? How can we proceed, or how can we proceed differently? And so this is a really, really important question, in part because in Mexico, it hasn't really been asked, I don't think. It hasn't really been considered too much. Whereas in places like Barcelona or Venice or even Paris or London, the most visited cities in the world, you have often, not always, but often a sense of solidarity among the people, among the tourism workers. Not always, but usually it's broken up among the specific aspects of the industry. For example, hotels or museums and things like that, right? So that was a really, really important conversation that we had, and more or less coming to this conclusion that the tourism industry and even all of its green versions, the eco, the sustainable, the regenerative, and everything else, that each one of them really lacks philosophy, or a philosophy, right? Outside of this notion of we're going to do this, like we're not going to contribute any garbage or plastic, or, we're going to do only walking tours and things like that, right?
we're not going to use cars, etc. That the philosophy that's lacking is the very history within which these companies exist within, right? The history of the tourism industry and how it began and its consequences in the world outside of, the most obvious things. And so there's a lack of history, and there's a lack of a sense of consequence because of that lack of history. And what might come out of that, if it did change, right? If people did become more conscious about these things, would be a philosophy that reflects in detail, clearly, the consequences of its existence, of people's willingness to proceed as if it's necessary and mandatory in the world, and how it might be otherwise, right? And so that interview was with Maria and Sergio Yeo here in Oaxaca. Then finally, we spoke with Yasnaya Aguilar about identity, cultural appropriation, and the possibility of pilgrimage, right, as opposed to tourism. That was a really, really fascinating interview, conversation, in part because, it had a lot to do with the notion of who you are overseas, right? And generally, up until maybe the last 5 years, but surely continuing, is the notion that you are identified first and foremost by the nation state, right? Your passport, which country you came from. And that's more or less what allows people to judge. And so that was really fascinating because at the end of the day, Yasnaya's work has so much to do with this notion of our sense of national identity, especially being fraudulent and fabricated, right? Because at the end of the day, even growing up in Toronto, in Canada, it was very clear to me that I had nothing in common from, a rural farmer in Alberta. I had nothing in common with, someone from Nunavut in the Arctic, right? Almost nothing, right? And that the only thing that bound us together were these lines that were drawn on the map, however many decades or centuries ago, right? And then, of course, the ensuing dominant culture that's, kind of force-fed through television and, the cell phone and everything else. But at the end of the day, it's not only that you have nothing in common with them, or what you do have is very little, fabricated, fraudulent, etc., but you never actually meet those people, right? And that this notion of who you are through the lens of a passport has very little to do with how you are overseas, right? And that we have the capacity to undo for example, the ugly American stereotype, right? Not all Americans, not all people from the United States are ugly, right? Surely, I've met some misbehaved ones over the years, but, I've met a lot of such people from a lot of different countries and places throughout the world, and there's little that it has to do with that, with nation states, for example, because at the end of the day, what happens is we just end up generalizing. We end up reducing the other, right? And this is what happens to tourists when they come and visit a place, right? They all get lumped in to the same category, right? And maybe if there's like a slight or slightly long interaction with someone else, they'll ask you where you're from, right? And that'll give them their idea based on, again, your passport, who they think you are, right? And on and on. And this is why, this leads us to this question of, if you're an expat and I'm speaking here to Anglophones, I imagine, for the most part. If you're an expat, if you're a digital nomad, if you're a tourist in another place, right? Because English is the tourist language. You can go almost anywhere in the world. As long as you're not too far off the beaten path, you'll be fine, right? And so what is your responsibility in, arriving in a place? And because at the end of the day, without any sincere, enduring depth in conversation with the people that are hosting you, the people in the places that you go to, they're just going to continue to contend with you as a tourist, as a white person, or as a black person, or as an American, or as a French person, right? Or on and on and on, or as a man, a woman, etc., right? And so it is beyond necessary, again, I'll say it's mandatory, that there is some kind of willingness and among visitors in places not their own, among tourists in places not their own, to take this as their marching orders, that the more they proceed as a tourist, the more they turn the world into a touristic place, okay? Which is to say that everyone is just generalized, everyone is generalizing, everyone is reducible, and everyone is reductive, right? And that the continuation of this, of essentially a manner of prejudice, right? Because that's all it is, generalizing and stereotyping and reducing other people to whatever, fill in the blanks, is just prejudice. And so the unwillingness to engage with the people that are hosting you, right? The unwillingness to engage with your neighbors is the promise and invitation that prejudice continues snowballing, essentially, because the movement, the hypermobility, is not going to stop, okay? And it brings prejudice with it anywhere it goes. And as it deepens, so does prejudice, okay? So this is what I've come to, right? This is part of what I've learned over the course of the last 8 months. If we are to create as Anglophones, as visitors, tourists, locals, etc., people who are on perhaps, both sides of the spectrum, who are both locals, but people who weren't born here, for example, right? The marching orders, the mandatory movement of our times is in the neighborhood, is among the people that we live with, even if we have nothing to do with them, okay? This is how it's done, okay? It's the only way. It's the only way, because we all know that the industry is going to continue to deepen itself as late-stage capitalism and just the pressures of modern post-pandemic life, if you want to call it that, continue to bear down on working people, right? And that the vacation will offer them a week or two, right? But that week or two cannot be a vacation in the sense of vacating one's obligations. Okay, it cannot be. Because, all we have left then is just this cycle where we have escaping one thing to come back to the other, escaping that to get to the other, and on and on and on. Okay. So anyways, fuera los bárbaros de Oaxaca. The Barbarians of Oaxaca, get out. And I guess to finish, I'd like to sum it up. I'd like to consider and reflect upon Gustavo's proposed title for the project in this way. What if the barbarian in his proposal wasn't a person, but a condition, right? For the sake of ease, we could call it barbarianism, right? What if it was something like Barbarianism of Oaxaca, get out, right? How would we approach that then? How would we accomplish that then, right? Because the barbarian, at least among the Greeks, was just someone who couldn't speak the local language, right? So how do we proceed then? How do we come to speak a language, not just of local people, not just of their colonizers, right? But how can we begin to speak to each other in a way that conjures a language and a way of communicating, a way of interacting from and on the tongue that does away with foreignness, right? Little by little, at least among the people who live in that place, right? Foreignness will always be there, but the more foreign we are to our neighbors, the more we invite this prejudice, right? That has certainly been inviting resentment and hatred in this country that, at the end of the day, if we don't act on it, it's just going to get worse and worse. And, well, I don't want to start talking about what might happen, but there are already stories of violence in the air, okay, because of it. So this is where we are. This is when we are. And, may we not forget. May we remember in our days that we're needed. And this is part of it. So a deep bow once more to the Unitierra Oaxaca, to Gustavo, and to all of you who have listened. And thank you. Thank you. We'll see you in season 3. Thank you for listening to the End of Tourism podcast. If you'd like to get updates on new episodes, click subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening. You can now support our work, ensuring it continues and joining the conversation via our Patreon account at patreon.com/theendofTourism. That's patreon.com/theendofTourism. You can also follow us on social media under the handle The End of Tourism. Until then, farewell, friends.